Good evening. We can now start the webinar.
Okay. Warm greetings to one and all present here. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of Madras Christian College, the Department of Social Work, to this international webinar on Commonwealth Social Work History as part of World Social Work Day celebration. This webinar is jointly organized by Social Work History Network in collaboration with Department of Social Work, Madras Christian College, and Commonwealth Organization for Social Work. Social Work History Network, founded in the year 2000. It exists to explore the nature and growth of social work in order to inform contemporary policy and practice. It is an informal network of social workers, historians, archivists, researchers, educators, students, and social work policy makers. The Department of Social Work, Madras Christian College, offers a master's program in social work which molds prospective students to become the best social worker possible. It is widely known for the opportunities that provide its students in terms of cross-cultural experiences, international exposure, and linking theories with practice. Commonwealth Organization for Social Work is an organization for citizens of the Commonwealth who are interested in promoting and supporting social work and social development. It contributes a social work perspective to Commonwealth activities. As today's webinar is being conducted as part of the World Social Work Day celebration, I would like to begin by highlighting the tagline of World Social Work Day 2021, which was Strengthening Social Solidarity and Global Connectedness. Even through this international webinar, we could depict global connectedness by having speakers from different continents and participants from all over the globe. I hope this webinar will broaden our perspectives and will help us to prepare for the future by reviewing the past. We will now begin the inaugural function of this international webinar on Commonwealth Social Work History. Now, I call upon Mr. Israel Douglas, student convener for the college prayer.
Let's pray. O thou, who in days past did put it into the hearts of good men to found this college, for the imparting of sound learning, the building of character, and the spread of spiritual truth and knowledge of thyself. Bless our college and schools. May love, unity, and brotherhood be learned here. May industry, uprightness, and courage grow here. And from this place, may there be sent forth continually a stream of men and women who shall serve thee faithfully in thy will. Amen.
Thank you, Mr. Israel, for leading us in prayer. For the welcome address, we have with us Dr. Miriam Samuel. Dr. Miriam has been the head of the Social Work Department, Madras Christian College, since 1993. She is an expert in the areas of curriculum development for social work and has conducted various gender training programs, mental health programs for different groups. Ma'am has been teaching on topics related to mental health since the year 1989. She has been a pillar of strength and encouragement to the department and the students since its inception. Thank you for joining us, ma'am. Over to you for the welcome address.
Thank you so much, Jemimol. I'm really excited and thrilled to see this coming together virtually. It is definitely an honor and privilege for me to welcome you all to this international webinar on Commonwealth History of Social Work, organized to commemorate the World Social Work Day. This is a joint celebration of various social work organizations, very especially the Social Work History Network, the Commonwealth Organization for Social Work, and the Department of Social Work at Madras Christian College, India, that has come together jointly to organize this webinar. It indeed is a historic moment that social work networks and institutions can come together on one platform for the advancement of our profession. It truly is a time of Ubuntu as we stand together in solidarity in the midst of the global crisis that we are all in. What better way to celebrate and reinforce Ubuntu? I am because we are. Realizing the need to enhance global solidarity, global connectedness, and the common responsibilities we share as we are confronted with various global challenges that we as social workers, both educators and practitioners, have to respond on a daily basis. I think it is a time in history for social work when we really need to understand the connectedness of social work. And I think this theme of 2021 has really thrown the spotlight on this particular need for connectedness and solidarity in confronting the issues that we have before us. We have today representatives from various international organizations. We also have representatives from the International Federation of Social Workers, the IFSW. We have members from the Commonwealth Organization for Social Work, members from Social Work History Network, and also speakers from various other networks and universities across the globe. It is my privilege this evening for us in India. I know for some of you it's very early in the morning, but it is my privilege to welcome each of you warmly to this webinar as we look forward to hearing and learning from the rich experiences from the galaxy of speakers that we have scheduled for this event. So I warmly welcome all our speakers, all the representatives from the various organizations, and very especially all our students and faculty from the Department of Social Work. It's also my honor and privilege to welcome my principal, Dr. Wilson, and I'm so happy that he can join us for a few minutes. A very warm welcome to all the delegates, student participants, and all the others who've gathered here virtually today for this particular webinar. On behalf of the organizing committee, I take this time to warmly welcome you and look forward to a very, very active participation during the next 2 hours. Thank you all very much, and God bless.
Thank you, ma'am, for your warm and benevolent words. Dr. P. Wilson, the principal and the secretary of Madras Christian College, and also a professor of the Department of Chemistry. Being an avid researcher, few of his significant contributions are the initiation of MCC Research Colloquium and MCC MRF Innovation Park. He also takes initiatives to change MCC into an environment of research and innovation. Sir was supposed to join for the felicitation, but as he got engaged with some unexpected board meeting, he is unable to join us. However, he conveys his greetings and wishes for the success of this webinar. Now, for addressing the rationale of webinar, we have Dr. A. Sylvia Daisy in our midst. Dr. Sylvia works as an associate professor in the Department of Social Work, Self-Finance stream. She is also the direct in charge of MCC Family Institute, a center which caters to the health and economic needs of the rural and tribal communities. She is the newly elected chair of COSW and an honorary member of Community Advisory Board of NIRT, ICMR, member of Employment Generation, Skills Education and Livelihood Committee of Confederation of Indian Industry. She is known for her passion in teaching and acknowledged for her skills in research and networking. Thank you, ma'am, for widening. Thank you for having in midst of us, ma'am. Over to you.
Thank you, Jemimol. World Social Work Month greetings to all. In today's new normal of remote working, the social work fraternity from different Commonwealth countries have come together online to have a meaningful and colorful celebration by exchanging their thoughts. Ubuntu. The IFSW theme for this year's celebration gives a strong message that all of us are interconnected and our future is dependent on recognizing everyone and involving them in co-building a future that is fair, socially just, and sustainable. Together, we can change the world. As social workers, we cannot do magic. To change the world and change needs a thorough understanding of the history. Today's webinar focuses on the Commonwealth social work history. History helps us to understand the past, which in turn allows to understand the present and anticipate the future. In the face of COVID-19 and the related deprivations, discriminations, restrictions, and struggles, there is much to learn from the past on how such issues were handled by social workers successfully. History helps us understand and grapple with complex questions and dilemmas by examining how the past has shaped our professional behavior. The rich history of social work profession would help us to paint a detailed picture of where we stand today, make more sense of the current world, stay united to work for the future, upholding Commonwealth values such as cooperation, freedom of expression, human rights, respect, and peace. Together, let us make the world a better place to this and the future generations. Ubuntu. Thank you.
Thank you, Mom. Thank you, ma'am, for widening our thoughts and sharing the very purpose of this webinar. We have now come to the end of the inaugural function. Before we move on to the session, I would like to give few general instructions to the participants. Kindly ensure that your audio and video is muted throughout the session. Kindly post your questions in the Q&A box on Zoom and the chat box on YouTube. It will be answered towards the end. The link for attendance will be posted in the chat box on both Zoom and YouTube by the end. We request you to fill the attendance to receive e-certificates. Thank you. The chairperson for today's session is Dr. David N. Jones. Dr. David is a registered social worker with extensive experience in national and local government, public and private sector. He is the chair of the British Association of Social Workers and was the president of the International Federation of Social Workers. He is the COSW main representative to the Commonwealth institution. He is into policy making for the Commonwealth institutions. We are honored to have you, sir. Thank you for joining us. I request you to take over and chair the session.
Thank you very much, Jemmy. And it's really good to be here and to know that we have over 500 people registered for this webinar. So welcome to you all, wherever you are in the world. You've already heard that we are here organized by the Social Work History Network, and I recognize Keith Bilton, the chair of the network, with the Commonwealth Organisation for Social Work, and thank you, Sylvia, at MCC for coordinating all of this. And thank you to the students, some of whom are doing this work alongside their internal exams. So I think we are asking them to have, or asking that they get extra credits for this fantastic work. So thank you to all the students. And I'm really pleased to welcome Philip Murphy from the Institute for Commonwealth Studies in London. He will be speaking later. And we are seeing this webinar as the start of a much bigger project that will be looking at an academic study of the history of the development of social work across the Commonwealth. And we'll have more about that later. So what are we going to see today? And we must move quickly to our speakers. We have 4 videos. They've all been prepared in advance, so they are all ready to go. And we start by looking at the IFSW, International Federation of Social Workers archive. And Fiona Robertson and Nigel Hall will talk to us about the archives, particularly pulling out some Commonwealth themes. We will then have a roundtable discussion in Singapore, which is a form of oral history with some of the staff of the National University of Singapore, with Esther Goh, the current head of the department, reflecting on developments in Singapore. We will then have a short break, 5 minutes only. I think for 2 hours we need a little break. And then we will come back to hear from Charles Mbugua, who will be reflecting on the development of social work in Kenya. And that will be followed by Dr. Ledney Rock from Barbados, from the Caribbean, who has a fascinating presentation about social developments in the Caribbean, particularly since the 1920s. And Sharon Rose Gittins will be talking about the current structures of social work in Barbados. Philip Murphy will then give his reflections as a Commonwealth historian, and we will have a panel. Now, this is a lot to pack in, and we think we may need to take a little bit extra. So if you are able to stay with us until about 12:45, an extra 15 minutes, we are able to run over a little bit to enable a panel discussion with most of the speakers. Well, that is our program for the next 2 and a bit hours. Don't forget to put your questions in the chat or the Q&A, as Jemmy has asked us. But now we're ready to hear from Esther Goh in Singapore, and she will introduce her guests. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Kia ora, talofa and welcome. I'm Fiona Robertson from the IFSW Archivist. I've been involved with IFSW for since 2000, mainly as Treasurer and in other roles, and as the Archivist for 2013. And additionally, I'm a member of the Commonwealth Organisation for Social Work from 2002 until last year as Treasurer and as a board member. Why did I undertake to work on the archives projects? It's always been an area of interest in mine, mainly becoming from the fact that I have 2 skills, accountancy and social work, so I'm quite ordered, quite systems orientated. So I think it's important the history of IFSW and international social work is recorded and made accessible. During the Christchurch earthquakes of 2010, this was a catalyst for me to give input into the archives of IFSW. I saw buildings severely damaged, access to computers and passwords lost when buildings were so badly damaged that they just bulldozed them down with everybody's records in them. So this exceptional insight into what can go wrong, what may go wrong, gave me a desire to learn more from the earthquakes and put this into the IFSW Archives project.
Hi everybody, I'm Nigel Hall. I've got a history of teaching and practicing social work since the early 80s in both Zimbabwe and the UK, and working a long time with IFSW, more than 30 years, mainly developing publications and journals. I was the previous Human Rights Commissioner. I've worked with COSWA over many years, currently volunteering with the archives. For me, I think it's important to think of archives because it's good to record the development of social work in each country. And thinking of Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe started off with the white administration using social work as a social control measure against the urban, or keeping the urban black youth particularly in their place, and that leading today to a more post-independence concern over social development and dealing with rural poverty. So it's good to see that development and record that. And thinking of the post-Mugabe socioeconomic breakdown in Zimbabwe, the loss of all, much of the material held in the social work office there indicates how important it is to maintain records, and much of this is now being put back together. and maybe South Africa, thinking of the progress from segregated social work organizations in that country to a unitary national association. All that information is in the archives in Switzerland and of value to IFSW. There's a picture of me meeting with my esteemed colleagues from the Zimbabwe Association back in the 1990s in Harare. And much of that information, as I said, is can be found in the archives.
So the archives developed as a project in 2013 under the direction of Gary Bailey, who was then the president. When we started to research the archives, we found information dating back to 1847. And anybody who thinks that working in the archives is a glamorous job, I can assure you that's not. That's me in the basement of the Swiss Association going through some old records, obviously needing preservation as I had white gloves so as not to damage the materials. And from that, conservation papers was actually the first step of the project. With reviewing and sorting through the documents, which now includes the country folders, they are in specific interest areas. From the records, we're starting to build up our archival electronic stored resources. What happened was with the paper copies, we assessed the paper copies, then they were scanned, and then they were electronically scanned. So that's we're starting to build up the electronic resources, and I used scan twice when I actually meant to say photocopied and then scanned. We have added some documents to the archives section of the IFSW website. Then with the assessments of the material, we've needed to research missing information. And another step in the project is there are many photos which have no indication of who the people are. So that will be a project which probably carries on for many years. And it's important that we celebrated our achievements in the progress of the archives at our general meeting, and our country members were very appreciative of being updated on a regular basis. And now we have on the website a section devoted to social workers who've made significant contributions to IFSW and/or social work. This is very much in its infancy and it's a work in progress. Again, this shows I was working in an attic, putting material into boxes and sorting through shelves of papers. And this gives you an idea of unsorted papers into plastic containers, then to shelves onto the IFSW office in Rheinfelden, where they're neat, tidy, and easily accessible for anybody who wants to research them.
And going through all that information, let us see really how far back the social work profession extends. And we found records back to 1847, the International Penitentiary Congress in Brussels proclaimed the necessity of establishing this contact between persons working to improve the lot of the working classes and indigent poor. So really showing the concern of social workers to deal with poverty and its effects in terms of crime in society. But there was only in 1889, Paris, a more social work specific event was held, which was the first International Congress on Statutory and Voluntary Assistance. And this was followed up by conferences in Geneva, and Paris, and Milan, and Copenhagen, Paris again in the early part of the 20th century, and the first international conference on social work held in Paris in July 1928, with over 5,000 participants representing 42 countries, including Canada, Great Britain, and South Africa. Quite amazing. So many people were involved right at the very beginning of the social profession. That 1928 conference led to the founding of the Permanent Secretariat of Social Workers, IPSSW, which is the forerunner to IFSW. Now, during times of crisis, as we continue through the 20th century, that led to further conferences. A second one was held in 1932 in Frankfurt with 1,200 delegates. Again, quite good attendance, very good attendance from 34 countries. And however, with the gathering conflicts in Europe, smaller conferences held in London in 1936 and Prague in 1940 did not, that's one did not proceed because of the gathering war clouds in Europe. In 1948, discussions continued to reform IPSSW into its current format of IFSW that was constitutionally incorporated in 1956 in Munich, in Germany. Now, we've collected together all the newsletters since 1962 until they stopped in 2002, and we scan them all and put them on the archives website, so you can get every single copy from during that period from the archives website. Fiona?
Okay, right. This is the first volume of the IFSW newsletter of 1958. And we're very lucky, and we were delighted when we actually found this amongst records in the IFSW office. So very exciting. The steps for uncovering information in the country folders, similar to the project, was the immediate paper preservation, removal of the rusty paper clips and staples, again copying at-risk papers and scanning them. There was a huge piece of work which was merging different country folder systems into one, sorting them in data order. So this was all quite boring, actually, to be quite honest. But we've also cross-referencing where country information is located in different parts of the archive. And we started assessing the merits of the historical documents. This is, again, a photo that was taken in the basement of the Swiss Association until the IFSW office moved away from there. So that's Rory and myself and Renee Schegg, who was very useful, especially when we needed to translate papers. This is not really a very good glamorous photo of the storage boxes in IFSW, but it is an ongoing piece of work. I'll hand Nigel.
Yes, and we were trying to see what there was to do with the Commonwealth. There's quite a lot of material in the archives there, particularly pertaining to the international conferences held around the Commonwealth. 1974, Nairobi, and then Hong Kong 80 in 2010, the Brighton Conference of 1982, 1984 and 2000 Montreal conferences, 94 Colombo conference, the unfortunately cancelled Zimbabwe conference in 2002, which could not go ahead because of the conflict there, which was a shame. 2004 Adelaide and 2014 Melbourne conferences, and generally quite a lot of information from the Africa region, as there is from all the other world regions as well, about membership development in the various countries. And as I mentioned, quite a lot of information about the censure and expulsion of South Africa and its later return to the IFSW.
Just adding in there that the IFSW office has got a full set of the African Journal of Social Work, which is probably one of the few places where you can get a full set of the journals.
The proceedings of the International Conference in Nairobi in 1974 are there in the archives. And then the same with Sri Lanka in 1994.
Just quickly pointing out that that's Tom Johansson, who was the Secretary General for a considerably long period of time. That was Sir Dwarrick Peck, who was president at that time. And there's Dudney Disnaika, who was actually one of the 4 supporters of setting up the Commonwealth Age Organising of Social Works. So, yeah. That's me at being part of Aotearoa New Zealand, participating on the world stage. Part of this presentation that is being organised is about development of social work in Commonwealth countries. I need to refer to the fact that in 1994, Aotearoa New Zealand developed a bicultural code of practice, which was a leading change for Indigenous people. So it sort of has preempted the recent discussions around colonialism and social work by having its own bicultural code of practice.
There's a picture from the general meeting in Jerusalem in 1998 with Hong Kong and Singapore together with Israel there. One of the many photographs held in the archives. And there's Uganda, a representative there participating at the meeting again in Jerusalem.
This is showing Alice Enville was president, then replaced by Melda Dodds, and that was Joe Gahar, who was the current president of the of Australian Association of Social Workers, that is taken in Jerusalem. Now there's a selection of documents held in the IFSW archives.
Some key documents relate to projects, quite important projects that IFSW and COSWA have been involved in over the years. A particularly relevant one is the report from the family and survivors of the tsunami, the terrible Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, and that was spearheaded by Dr. Tan Ngotiong and others from the Asia Pacific region. And then there's also the response to the needs of orphans and vulnerable children in Africa, reports from meetings and seminars there, the Young Carers regional workshops funded by the Commonwealth Foundation, and that's particularly organized by David Jones, and I was involved and other people too. So there's some useful information there.
Right, I'm going to go through these reasonably quickly. In the country folders, we have papers from Ghana on the IFSW seminar in '74, the Tanzanian Association newsletter in 1995, Singapore Association of Newsletter 1972, Aotearoa New Zealand Report to Bangkok Conference in 1967, paper on social development strategies for Uganda in 1970, report of social work in the family Zambia in 1986, report of social problems in Australia in 1967, Journal of Professional Social Work Malaysia 1984.
There's a COSWA meeting there at the Israel World Conference 1998. We can see on the extreme left there Terry Bamford, unfortunately passed away, but he was a very key person involved with COSWA and IFSW. We've got Charles Mabugua sitting there. I was mentioning Josephat Matu, who was also quite key with COSWA, but that's Charles there, and that's
Jeanette Conway from Australia.
From Australia there.
Yep.
Yeah, and there's a picture from the Melbourne conference with a variety of very young-looking people there participating at that meeting.
Right.
There's also a booklet on the 50 years celebrating the Golden Jubilee of IFSW, which I penned, put together some years ago now. I think it was 1988, and that's available online as well as in the archives office, the office in the in Switzerland?
Right, I just want to take time to point out that we are planning a celebration for the 100 years since the Paris meeting of 1928, which was the forerunner of IFSW, and have developed a section on the website. This is a work in progress, so any suggestions and contributions are welcome. Please do email me. Also, I want to show just some of the links on the archives for you to consider. The most interesting for me was in 1932, the piece of hotel paper with the signed attendance of those who set up basically the forerunner of IFSW following the 1928 meeting. So just to conclude that, I think the Commonwealth is interesting. When you look at that photo, 2 Kiwis and a Zimbabwe Brit. So I think in terms of commitment to international social work and development, we're all very active, and yes, just want to thank people who supported us, and this and hand over to Nigel, whether he's got any comments he wants to make.
Yes, now that we, the archives, as we were saying, is held in Switzerland, but we try to make as much available online as possible through the IFSW website. So if you go onto the IFSW site, you'll find the archives page, and there's a lot of information, which hopefully is going to increase over the coming years. Okay, no, thanks very much, everybody, for listening to us, and good luck with the conference.
Well, thank you so much, and my apologies. The first mistake of the webinar was introducing Singapore when I should have introduced Fiona and Nigel, who presented on the IFSW archive. Fascinating. Who would think it would go back to the 1840s? But Fiona has played a very important role as Treasurer of the International Federation of Social Workers and of the Commonwealth Organisation for Social Work. So thanks, Fiona, for all of that work and for that presentation, and also to Nigel, who has played a number of key roles in both organisations as well. They've been with us, and I think Nigel will be joining us, but by the time we get to the discussion, it will be midnight or after in New Zealand, which is where Fiona is. We now move straight on to Singapore. Esther, I apologize for introducing you too early, but now we have the video from Singapore, and Esther Goh will introduce her colleagues, retired members of the Department of the National University of Singapore. So now over to Singapore and Esther Goh.
Everyone, this is Esther Goh from the National University of Singapore Department of Social Work. Today, it's my great pleasure to be in the company of all my social work teachers. These teachers taught me and generations of social workers in Singapore. So let me introduce on my right, Dr. Roslyn Au, and on my left, Professor S. Vasu and Mr. John Ang. And they each have wonderful history of social work education in Singapore to share with you. So to begin with, we'll talk a little bit about the early days of social work education in Singapore in the 1950s to 1960s, because our training started as diploma, 2 years diploma, and we were born within the Department of Economics until much later, and we became an independent department. So probably Prof. Vasu and Mr. Ang would like to share a little bit about your experience being a student of that program, and what was the memory like for that program?
Well, when we first started, it's after the post-war, and post-war, as you all appreciate, is the ravages of war, the problems of squalor, problems of poverty, problems of underemployment, problems of disease, epidemics and all that. So social work program didn't start with a degrees emphasis. It started with people who are matured, people who are working in the various social welfare services. And they were people who needed to be professionalized. And hence the diploma program started with the initiation of providing them the social work tools to learn about how to manage issues, how to examine problems in the community, problems in the workplace, and how they could deliver an effective social service programs in their respective settings.
Mr. Ang, you have anything to add?
I think Vasu is right. The training of social studies majors was largely to fulfill manpower requirement of the then social welfare department, because after the Second World War, the major thing that the government was grappling with was missing persons, helping to trace and reconnect family members who during the war may have scattered to Indonesia, Malaysia, and all parts of Southeast Asia. Then there were people who didn't have jobs, didn't have money, there was a lot of poverty. They had to open up soup kitchens, so to speak. So I think the social welfare department was in a great hurry to employ people to service all these needs. And time went on then, they needed to be trained, because I remember I was still a young boy then, living in the villages, and social welfare officers would come. They were called investigators, and when they come around the corner, the neighborhood will all inform each other, "Holy Polilo," meaning social welfare department personnel who were wearing white and white would come, and their role was to investigate whether government should give you public assistance or not. And what they did was to go into your homes unannounced, go to the kitchen, open up the pot and pans and say, "What do you have inside? You have meat inside." And so the neighbors were informing each other so that they would hide whatever that was not supposed to be what they were cooking, so that they would appear to be poor enough to receive public assistance. So looking at the other side then, the social welfare officers really did not know very much about what they were supposed to do. And it was always fulfilling government functions. And therefore, I think there was this great need to produce the manpower required with deeper thinking, greater understanding of social sciences and psychology and so on, so that they would bring that level of expertise into the social welfare department.
Well, John, I think to add to that, you have a program, diploma program to train mature people with a multidisciplinary focus. You have geography, human geography, you have economics, you have law, you have psychology, you have philosophy, and all sociology together with anthropology and all that. So that provided a wider perspective for them to understand and appreciate things, so that they can be able to present and build better rapport with those that they are helping in order to deliver effective services to the settings in which they operate.
I read with interest that this diploma in social studies, right, had a big component of dissertation. About 1/3 of the curriculum was devoted to dissertation. I wonder why.
I think John has indicated that you need to try and get these mature workers to have a very research-oriented focus to understand and appreciate issues with a deeper focus. They are all practice-oriented, so they require training and to get the research tools to understand and appreciate how to analyze problems and study problems in greater depth. Mm-hmm. And hence, students were like myself and all those who are associated with me those days would study, And in my case, I looked at the medical focus, people who are affected by disease, asthma, who were unable to work because of their illness, and then to see what are the issues affecting this group of people.
So in the sense, the dissertation by the students contributed to local knowledge.
The idea is to provide them the tool to analyze issues and then to contribute the development of local knowledge in social work. And as you can see, based on archives and all that, they produce beautiful dissertations which document different issues of the community itself.
The methodological approach was largely anthropological, non-participant observation. Not a lot of statistics involved, but a lot of emphasis on how do you get to the heart of the problem, how do you interview people to get them to share what their issues are, and then by simple 2x2 analysis to produce some tables in order to try and see whether there is some correlation and so on. So the level of sophistication that we have today was not there, but nevertheless, I think we produce a rich store of information about social issues, about life, about poverty, about different circumstances that vulnerable people were in. And this whole store of knowledge contributed to the government planning what to address in the social welfare department.
I think the important thing is that such studies provided a perspective in terms of policy development, improvements to service delivery, and then helping the agencies itself to think of innovative ways to solve problems and to be able to reach out to the very people that they are serving. And that, I think, is a very important contribution.
So from the very early days in the 50s and 60s, the Department of Social Work, then maybe not an independent department yet, the social study program already had very strong link and very grounded in the local practice context. So I'd like to invite Dr. Roslyn Au to share with us what was the experience being a student in the degree program. Later on, it actually evolved into a degree program. And then after you finish your degree program and become a social worker, worked and went overseas for further studies and then joined the department upon the invitation by the then head of department, Mrs. Amwee, because she was intentionally grooming local faculty members.
Thank you, Esther. I think one of the things that I remember best about my experience as a student in the department was that we had 4 field placements, one of which we did in the Peninsular Malaysia.
Wow.
So I was actually on placement in the Malaysian Social Welfare Department, and I had to work with very poor families, for example, from the rubber plantations. So we had to travel long distances in a Range Rover and then went into the rubber plantations and work with people who were in need in the plantation. So that was one of my most, I suppose, useful experience in terms of my social education in the late 1960s, early 70s. Right. Of course, since then, because of for various reasons, our field placement had been cut down to 2, and that has to do with the evolution of what's happening in the university as a whole. And after I graduated in the early 70s, I actually worked in Singapore, and at that time, that was the beginning of the housing program. So there were lots of families who lived in rather cramped housing. And in one of my field placements, Dr. Vasu was my field supervisor. So we work with community development programs in a new housing estate at that time. Right. And I remember we had to work at night because we had to wait for people to finish their work, come home, have their dinner, and then we could have community meetings. So we actually worked like until 11 p.m. then we went home. So that was part of our field placement experience. That was my field placement experience, in addition, of course, to other experiences of working with the disabled. And after I graduated, I actually worked for a few years in the housing estate in Singapore. And then I decided that I needed to learn a little bit more about social work and think a little bit more about what social work is about. So I went and did my master's program in the UK. When I was in UK, the focus in my master's program was not so much on the doing, but on the understanding. And on finding out all these books and theories and methods that we wrote about, does it really work? When does it work? In what kind of situation does it work? And when do we need to look at new ways of doing things? So that, in a way, influenced the way I taught social work. It was not just about teaching people how to do things, it's about thinking about why we do it and how can we do it better. Then I think my stint in UK was also useful because when I finished my master's program, I worked for a couple of years in a children's group home. And that was when my interest in cross-cultural social work actually took root. I realized that sometimes we see things from a different perspective, and it's not necessarily wrong. Being different is not being wrong. It's just seeing things from a different set of values, a different framework, and a different maybe set of beliefs. And very often, things like honesty, being helpful, kindness, it's all the same goals. It's how we go about doing it.
And that is so important because Singapore is such a multicultural, multi-ethnic society. So this is very relevant to the local context, the cross-cultural sensitivity in social work practice.
Yeah, I think in Singapore it's very relevant, but I think one of the challenges is how to balance between the realism and being communal. I think we all have to see each other as having the same goals and purposes and objectives, but we may be actually trying to reach them in many different ways. People say all roads lead to Rome, but I think that maybe more true is that many roads lead to Rome. And so we have to, as social workers, choose the road that best suits the context.
I think because of time, right, I have to draw to a close here, but there's so much history, so rich from these 3 teachers, their own experience in practice, in teaching, in passing on their wisdom to different generation of social work students and social workers, right? I think we need to do a part 2 of this recording, or even part 3. But I want to bring to a pause here for this video's purpose. But before I do that, right, I think I would like to invite all of them to give maybe 30 seconds of what you foresee, project, prophesy social work education would be like in the next 10 years or 20 years. The department is coming to 70 years. So I am encouraging everybody to imagine the next 70 years. So probably you would like to share your imagination for the next 20 years?
Well, I think it is exciting because we are all going to face global changes, climate changes, ecological changes, and different types of changes that affects human life. And social work must be in the forefront to be able to appreciate this. I would see that student needs to be trained to manage and analyze things. They have to have skills in social analytics, for example, so that they can understand and appreciate and anticipate what is forthcoming. Secondly, we got to promote self-help, and I think there's a need for us to think about how to harness the goodness in people, the abilities of people, and those who can to help those who cannot. And if we can do that, then we will be able to enhance the social health of any society in which we live. And we need to also learn skills about setting up social enterprises. That is very important, so that people can then learn how to self-help and run enterprises with the cooperation and support amongst one another to bring change in the community.
Excellent. Short and very concise, Dr. Au.
Okay. Well, social work started post-independence as a formal discipline, and its main role was actually to participate in nation building. And I foresee that in the next 10 years, that's not going to change. As the nation change, as Dr. Vasu said, in terms of political, social, economic, and infrastructures, I think social work will have to change, metamorphosize in tandem with those changes.
Mr. Ang?
I think if you look at the long history of, let's say, 100 or so years, the idea of empire, because we're talking to a Commonwealth countries audience, you all know what empire is all about. It's largely exploitative. And I think that post-empire period was the period of nationalism, where we talk about building our nation up, how we contribute our expertise to leverage up the vulnerable poor and so on. But I think going into the future, I think the idea of nationhood has to be moderated so that we talk more about regionalism, about internationalism and so on, because human lives are to be appreciated not within national boundaries. You have more and more people crossing national boundaries for work. I think more and more you will have this refugee problem, you'll have migrant workers, you'll have international kind of issues, whether they be human rights issues, educational needs, climate change needs, and so on. And I think a single government is not going to be able to take care of its own population without regard to the regional bodies, to the international community. So I think our social work training must broaden to talk about humanism, the human focus, and what is it about living in this world? What should human beings be able to do, to contribute, to live more abundantly, to flourish? And how do social workers contribute to this whole idea about flourishing of the human race?
In short, it's a partnership, cooperation between different groups in the community, living together to harness resources together in order to find more meanings for personal and group and societal development. I think that's probably a very important point that social workers can work towards.
Thank you for your word of wisdom and prophecy. We have to move forward together, not just as a profession, but society, the people together. Thank you. So we'll just end at this point. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to Esther and friends and colleagues in Singapore, illustrating the importance of collecting oral histories. And one of the objectives of the proposed project between the Commonwealth Organisation for Social Work and the Institute for Commonwealth Studies is to develop a collection of oral histories around the Commonwealth. Reference there to Anne Wee, who was the head of the department in Singapore. She has died recently, but wrote a book just before she did, which I reviewed in, I think it was the International Journal of Social Work, a fascinating personal reflection on her life developing social work in Singapore. And John Ang at the end there bringing some big themes together, but perhaps touching on the big emphasis across the whole of the Commonwealth and indeed the world about decolonializing the curriculum and what does that actually mean, which of course any study of Commonwealth history takes us into inevitably. Well, we're now going to take just 5 minutes, and it is actually going to be only 5 minutes because we've still got a lot to pack in. So a short break, and during the break there will be some music and some pictures from Chennai and from India as we are reflecting on World Social Work Month here. So we'll see you back in 5 minutes. It is exactly 5 minutes from now, but thank you to the presenters of the two videos to start with. Next comes Kenya, but now the break. Well, I think that was exactly 5 minutes. I hope you had a chance to get something to drink or go to the loo or do whatever you needed to do in those 5 minutes. And we're now ready to go straight on into our next video. I introduce our next speaker in the video. So we're now going to Nairobi to join Charles Mbugua. Well, we've heard from Singapore, and now we're going to hear from Charles Mbugua, who's in Nairobi, and he's going to talk about the development of social work and social service and community development in Kenya before and after independence in 1963. Charles has been active in international social work for a very long time. He came to the Brighton IFSW conference in the 1980s, but more recently was president for Africa of the International Federation of Social Workers. He's on the board of the Commonwealth Organization for Social Work and is a past president of that group. And he's also a link with UN Habitat, United Nations agency based in Nairobi. So Charles, it's really good. This was your idea really to have this focus on the history of social work in the Commonwealth. So thank you for that idea. And over to you to talk about social work developments in Kenya. Thank you.
Thank you, David. You are right, because as you have rightly said, it's important for us to track back the history of social work. And here in Kenya, the information available dates back to the days when the first missionaries, the explorers, people like David Livingstone, Dr. Clough, when they visited Africa for the first time. And stories are told about what they are doing in missionary work and what they were doing in terms of what was social work then. And it has always been a feeling that it is important to track back and gather this history and correct this information for us to have the comparison of what was happening and what the changing face of social work since then. Here in Kenya, for instance, the first missionaries came through the seaport of Mombasa, and they were offering services alongside other missionaries who had came from Germany. And when we look back today, we see the missionary work starting from what we may call the first churches, the churches which were built pre-colonial period. And we trace back some developments which happened then in terms of the schools and the colleges, and some training aspects which were foreign in terms of saying the practices which happened were directly from the missionaries. And that was around pre-colonial period. And then came around before the First World War. We have stories told, we see monuments relating to some good development work done since then. We see, again, churches, we see schools, and then we also get a lot of oral history which has been passed on from generation to generation. Then later we come to the colonial era. Again here, we see a lot of activities, a lot of things relating to social work, again, spreading to schools, spreading to hospitals, spreading to communities. We see practices which touched on issues to do with health. And we also see other players in form of missionaries, foreign missionaries, who came and settled in specific areas, normally where churches had already been established. And from those points, we see education springing up from those areas and spreading inwards. We also see hospitals spreading outwards, and thereafter, then we look at the colonial period itself. That's around 1940s, 1950s. Then we also see a lot of development. We see a lot of work which was done by the colonial government. We see those people who had already gone through those schools and those colleges getting employment within the colonial government, either as teachers or as policemen or in the army or in the various sectors. And then we see quite a few of them going out of the country and intermingling with other nations in places like India, in places like South Africa as well. And then we also see, when they come back, we see differences in terms of the livelihood and the activities that were undertaken then, relating to delivery of services to the communities and to the then vulnerable groups. Then we come to the around 1955 towards 1960, what we may call was the epitome, the climax of what we'd call was the conflict between the locals and the colonial government. Several groups agitating for independence. And although it was really a period of conflict, there were still some activities going on in terms of services delivery, in terms of a program which touched on development of roads, development of agriculture, particularly in terms of areas to do with soil conservation, which was part of community development. And although most of it was done through forced labor, a closer look would definitely separate the intentions and the benefits which accrued thereafter, and what the subject then saw as oppression. Thereafter, then we saw we see the coming of the independence in Kenya. That is after 1963. By then, there were a lot of several programs, mainly by the colonial office, to do with health, particularly in the area of child mortality, in the area of community development, in terms of teaching young mothers some skills to do with the tailoring, to do with sewing, to do with the nutrition, to do with personal hygiene, and all that was done by people who by then were applying what today we the core social work skills. From these groups, then we saw that we saw a development of various groups, particularly women groups, and they developed into what in Kenya we called maendeleo ya wanawake, which means is a women development movement. The purpose of that movement was mainly to focus on child health, personal hygiene, and community development, mainly issues which revolved around the family, because by then most of the men were either in the army or most of them were in the forest fighting for independence. So the hands of the families were then mothers mainly, and it became important for them to be taught simple hygiene skills in terms of how to take care of children, the feeding, on maternity issues, because there were no maternity hospitals and the people are giving birth at home. So the mothers needed to understand and to know how you deal with giving birth at home and how you nurture the young child and the first steps of the precautions relating to child health. So those movements later developed into a big movement of of women movement, as I say, called the maendeleo ya wanawake, or women empowerment. And from those groups were selected very specific women to learn skills to do with issues which later developed into what you may call teaching skills, and most of them were selected to go and into teacher training colleges. They became teachers, and from teachers, there was a section of what was the children teaching and the community teaching. The community teaching mainly focused on issues to do with social work. Thereafter came 1963, we got our independence. And then after that, the same group, with the support of the colonial office once again, and they had already gotten skills, we witnessed a lot of these women mainly getting employed into government offices to do simple clerical jobs, messenger jobs, translation jobs, because they had already learned a little bit of English. They had interacted with missionaries. They were doing a lot of church work, and therefore it was easy for them to do the office work. When it became apparent that there was a need to develop government manpower in terms of what the new government needed, a lot of them were selected to go and do several courses, and specifically to do courses related to family welfare and the welfare in general within the government sectors. Then came 1963 again, when we got into independence. And because of the tensions which had existed then, and because again because of the converging of the groups which were involved into in the what we called the agitation for independence, which were completely two different groups. It became apparently very difficult for the new government to handle them, and therefore a policy was a kind of passed which more or less focused on dealing with the groups which were not really contributing towards the building of the new nation. Most of these were the vulnerable groups, and most of them were the groups which had come from the rural areas to the urban areas, because most of the people thought with the new independent state, life was better in cities, there were opportunities in cities, and therefore there was a lot of movement from the rural areas to the urban areas. And the government, to curtail that rural-urban migration, came with a policy which they called back to the land, which means you go back to the rural areas, because coming to the cities was creating more problems. From there, we saw a lot of agencies now dealing with populations which was in towns, and the government kind of backtracked in helping them. A lot of groups came, then a lot of foreign groups. The churches program were intensified. A lot of foreign embassies got involved, and the mainstream churches, mainly Church of England, Church of Scotland, and the Catholic Church, came up with programs to deal with the problems then. These were the groups which were driving policy. They were the groups which were driving the attention of the government in terms of the people who needed help, the people who had migrated to the urban areas, the refugees, the vulnerable groups, after 1965, there was direct training now for social workers, started by the Israel government, and the first school was established here. Thereafter, the programs, we are seeing programs coming and developing, and up to today. But after independence, what was striking in Kenya is that when the new government was kind of identifying the manpower needs for the new independent state, social work was not seen as a priority. And therefore, in the government planning for manpower, social work was not included. And even today, we see the same problem because of the lack of inclusion at that early stage. We still see social work as compared to the other sectors is still lacking behind. So in nutshell, it is important for us to start looking back and get into the depth of the development of social history, what actually was happening, and what the social work was like in the 19th century, because it was there. What social work was during the pre-colonial period, what was social work was during the colonial period, and what it was like after independence. Of course, when we relate this to the present issues, when we subject what was happening to our modern human rights instruments, our ethical codes, our knowledge today, I do believe there is so much that we need to harvest, and it is important that we harvest this, we document it, and we own it so that we don't lose it. Back to you, David.
Thank you very much, Charles. That's a fascinating sweep over more than 100 years of social history. So thank you very much indeed. And now we're going to move on to our next speaker, which is from Barbados. Thank you, Charles, and see you later. Thank you. Well, Charles and I went on to have an interesting conversation about Ubuntu and the indigenous ideas about community, but unfortunately for time, we had to cut that from the video. So thank you, Charles. And interesting that Charles and Esther and her guests in Singapore were both drawing out the constant tensions between government policy and social work knowledge, experience and practice, and how they influence each other, and the extent to which governments listen to the reality of the social life which social workers can bring to the fore. So we're now going to move on to the Caribbean and hear first from Letney Rock and then from Sharon Rose Gittins. So let us go straight on to the next video. And thank you, colleagues in Chennai, for keeping us going so effectively, all running smoothly so far. Let's hope it continues. Here's the Caribbean. Well, now we've come to the last of our speakers, and we're going to hear from the Caribbean. And we have two speakers. Dr. Letney Rock is the former head of the Department of Government Sociology and Social Work at the University of the West Indies, Barbados campus, and also the coordinator of the social work program. Like many of us, she's retired, but working still as hard as ever. So welcome, Letney. And Sharon Rose Gittins is the current president of the Barbados Association of Social Workers, coming near to the end of her term, I think. But Letney is going to give us an overview of the development of social work in the Caribbean, and Sharon Rose is going to talk specifically about Barbados. But now, if the technology works, I'm handing over to Letney, who's got a presentation for us and is going to share the screen, and we will be away looking at the history of social work in the Caribbean. Letney, over to you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Today, I'm going to be speaking about the development of social work in the English-speaking Caribbean. Now, many of the countries of the Caribbean, of the English-speaking Caribbean, are independent nations. There are still a few territories that belong to metropolitan countries such as Britain, Spain, France, the US, and the Netherlands. All of the countries have had a history of transatlantic slavery and a colonial past. Here you see a map of the Caribbean. This is the region that I'll be speaking about. Now, social welfare services in the Caribbean were introduced approximately 100 years ago after the African slaves were emancipated. These services all emerged in response to the social development needs of the region. According to Barker in the Social Work Dictionary, 1999, social development is planned, comprehensive social change to improve people's general welfare. Now, when slavery ended in the Caribbean region in 1838, the region was ripe for social, economic, and political change. But this was slow to happen, and the situation of the poor and the working class deteriorated very much. And by the third decade of the 20th century, the people in the British Caribbean territories still experienced disenfranchisement, poor working conditions, unemployment, poor housing, low wages, poverty, and generally poor social living conditions. Now, this situation was aggravated by the worldwide economic depression being experienced during the 1930s. And the inhumane conditions led the workers in the British West Indian territories to political unrest. There was unrest throughout the British West Indies because in a forceful way, people demanded social and economic justice and social change. These unrests are referred to as the 1930s riots, and after the riots, the British government set up what is known as a Royal Commission, the Moyne Commission, to investigate the situation which had led to the rioting in the colonies. Here, very quickly, I have excerpts from, this is a photo of rioting, actual photo of rioting in Jamaica, and this is Barbados, riots in the land. Now, the report of the commission, the West India Royal Commission report, which can be found in the British Library, was written in 1938, and it exposed the poor living conditions existing in the British colonies at the time. But it also made recommendations for the reform of social, political, and economic conditions. And these reforms were to be made through the expansion of education and health services, improved housing conditions, the establishment of labor departments, land settlements, and social welfare. It was quite a comprehensive report on the conditions that existed. So as a result of the report and its recommendations, the British government passed what has been known to be the Colonial Development and Welfare Act, which established a Colonial Development and Welfare Fund. This fund was to be administered through the Colonial Development and Welfare Office in London, and it was intended to provide funding to the colonies to deal with the problems impacting the people. History records that £5 million were to be allocated annually to the colonies to help improve conditions there, and to administer the funds, a welfare fund was set up in various territories across the British West Indies. And this was the beginning of social, economic, and political reforms in the colonies. Now, among the initiatives that were put in place to address the existing social problems was the training of selected personnel in the various colonies who had been newly appointed and designated as social welfare officers. And this was one of the recommendations, that colonies should appoint social welfare officers. And according to Maxwell 2002, this was to prepare these officers in some measure for their new responsibilities. And history records that a total of 7 6-month training courses were held annually or biannually in Jamaica between 1943 and 1953. And these courses were delivered under the auspices of the new University College of the West Indies Extramural Department. And this started, of course, in 1948. Now, in addition to the regional training, selected personnel from various colonies in the Caribbean also had the opportunity to go. Most completed a 2-year diploma in social work administration at British universities, including the University of Swansea. Added to these initiatives was the development of a training program in the 1940s and 50s for welfare workers in Jamaica, by an organization called Jamaica Welfare Limited. Now, the training offered by Jamaica Welfare Limited focused on community development, self-help, and mutual aid, as well as issues addressing poverty in peasant and farming communities. But these initiatives were the impetus for the future development of formal social work practice and education in the English-speaking Caribbean. Now, the training in social welfare that was being delivered out of the University College of the West Indies eventually evolved into a social work certificate at the Mona campus in Jamaica in 1961, and it continued to cater to social welfare personnel in the region. So we can see that out of the recommendations, you had training at British universities. You also had the 6 months courses being delivered through the extramural department. The Jamaica Welfare Limited also offered some training in community development, self-help, mutual aid, etc. And all of this eventually culminated with a certificate program at the Mona campus in Jamaica in 1961. Now, the countries of the English-speaking Caribbean at the time were still colonies of Britain, and so the program at the Mona campus was modeled to a large extent on that of British universities. So by 1970 now, because we had more trained personnel in the region, social welfare services had increased throughout the Caribbean. Not only because we had more trained persons, but we also have, alongside that, various emergent social problems such as child abuse and neglect, neglect of the elderly, gender-based violence, mental illness, etc. Also meant that additional training was necessary. So we needed more personnel to perform social welfare services. Now, the certificate program at the Mona campus therefore evolved into a full bachelor's degree program in 1961. And then you had the social work programs being introduced at the St. Augustine campus, as well as the Cayfield campus. The Cayfield campus in 1988 and the St. Augustine campus in 1990. These both offer the original Mona model of a 2-year certificate, which served as an intermediary step to the bachelor's degree. Just a quick view of Cayfield campus, St. Augustine campus. Now, if we look at education and training together, this steady growth in social work educational programs was not per chance. It was a response to the impact of socioeconomic conditions occurring in the region and elsewhere over time. These conditions demanded attention to the plight of the people, particularly the poor and disadvantaged. And so there was further growth in programs that was, concomitant with the emergence of this range of social services. And as you can see here to the right, a number of services emerged over time: services to children, school social work services, correctional services, services for the disabled, services for women, medical social services, family services, drug abuse counseling, etc., etc. And many services evolved over time. What must be noted is that there was not an even development of social work services across the English-speaking Caribbean. Some countries had more resources than others. Some had a few more trained personnel than others. In fact, some did not have many trained personnel at all. And so there was this uneven development of services, and the challenges, as I've noted here, were basically lack of finances and other resources, political will, outdated legislation, and lack of qualified and highly trained personnel. The countries of Barbados, Jamaica, and Trinidad today they have the widest range of services, and the services are more sparse. That is, the social welfare services or social work services are still fairly sparse in some of the smaller territories of the English-speaking Caribbean. Some of the developments have been influenced by the country's ratification of the various UN treaties, for example, CEDAW and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, so that once countries had ratified these various UN treaties, they are and have been encouraged to provide services to deal with the resulting issues addressed by the conventions. And finally, today, apart from the University of the West Indies, which offers social work education programs at 4 of its campuses, there are also a number of other tertiary institutions in the English-speaking Caribbean that now offer social work programs from the certificate level through to the PhD level. And this is all in an effort to meet the demand for social work training and enable the professionalization of the profession through having more skilled personnel. So if you come to the Caribbean today, you will find social workers working in many agencies and program areas, as I've listed here. And there are many more trained social workers in the Caribbean, not only trained within the Caribbean area, but also in the US, USA, and Canada. And we are also members not only of the Association of Caribbean Social Work Educators and other local professional bodies, social work bodies, but also the international bodies of IFSW, IFSW, and ICSW. And in the region, we host a biennial international conference for social workers, but we also participate in international conferences. So I hope that this presentation has given you a little bit of insight into the development of social work services as well as social work education in the Caribbean. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Letni, for that very comprehensive overview of the social developments in the Caribbean, in the English-speaking Caribbean, and taking us right up to date. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're now moving to Sharon Rose, who is going to talk to us about the development of social work agencies and social work delivery in the Caribbean, and particularly Sharon Rose in Barbados. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you too. And it is a great opportunity to be able to share with you that I am one of those social workers that Dr. Letni spoke about. If you come to the Caribbean, you will find in one of the agencies. And I'm also very thankful of the legacy in which the journey of social work has taken. I am based at the Welfare Department. So let's take a look at where I work and where you will find many other social workers. Between 1677 and 1945, as shared by Dr. Letni Rock, social worker was clearly a non-existent profession because those were the days during slavery, and the slave master provided all the physical needs such as clothing, food, and shelter. Now we had in Barbados the first social worker actually came to Barbados in 1945, Miss Betty Arn, and she arrived here from Britain, and she was also paid from Britain. Then in 1952, she was appointed the first chief welfare office. And as you can imagine, based on what Dr. Rock has shared, there were very few people at that time in the office. And she'd also highlighted the 1946 to 1947, a lot of training courses being offered and persons would have gone to Jamaica. But in 1949, that's where my department was first established. And Betty Arn would have advised Barbados government on all aspects of social services, even how to strengthen those voluntary groups and organizations working in the social field, and even as well to control the staffing training needs by recommending those candidates for training. So not everybody who came forward went off to training. She had to recommend the particular individuals. And again, as to reinforce the point, back then it was 6 months training in Jamaica for that certification course in social work. And the likes of Hilgard Weeks, Ina Lynch, and Humphrey Walcott are 3 Barbadians who would have been part of that era. And I just want us to take a little bit more closer look to the period of 1969 to 1980, reinforcing again what we shared earlier. So you had in 1969, yes, the legislation to guide the department, that's the National Assistance Act, and it laid the foundation for our social work services. And it also laid the foundation for the emergence of our social service agencies, which had a specific mandate to a specific group of vulnerable persons. So as you can see here, in the 1980s, a lot sprung up. You had the Child Care Board, Care and Protection of Children, National Assistance Board, Care and Protection of the Elderly, the National Disabilities Unit, who mandate was mainly pertaining to those persons with disabilities. And community development, believe it or not, which came out of the welfare department, focused on community projects, community businesses, and even the arts of persons. So where you had productions in theaters, that was actually part of the welfare department until it was separated out into the community development department, which is all these departments are still existing today. And of course, where we had deviant youth, then there was the probation department for both youth and juveniles. So the welfare department covered many groups of vulnerability back then. However, we need to look at where welfare department is now, and it falls under the Ministry of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs. And the organizational structure is not just one person anymore. We have a structure that speaks to Chief Welfare Officer, Deputy Chief Welfare Officer, Senior Welfare Officers who, thanks to the emergence of schools and training and universities, we not only hold bachelors in social work, masters of social work management and administration. Now, some of the persons who have been employed in the department are also persons who came from England with a social work degree and practice here in Barbados. Our overall vision is to provide the highest quality of social services, which will support and develop and empower the vulnerable as well. So it isn't just giving the help, but we want persons to be able to rise through that help and using the resources that they have. The mission or professional social work services were geared primarily and continue to be geared on the resolution of individuals and family problems, enhancement of personal and social development, alleviate poverty, and empower and rehabilitate, take note, the disabled, the advantaged, and those affected by crisis as well as a natural disaster. Welfare Department now. National assistance means relief if any form granted to a person in accordance to the Act. So yes, we are still guided by that National Assistance Act, and there's some changes that need to take place and I believe will take place. At this present time, we still give assistance in kind and assistance in cash. So what is our assistance in kind that's providing the clothing, dentures, spectacles, food assistance, education assistance, basic furnishings, rental fees assistance, and burial assistance. On the other hand, our assistance in cash, which is financial help, is given according to persons, children, disabled persons, unemployed adults, elderly persons, and special cases of persons infected with HIV or AIDS. And we are also very much engaged in the assistance in cash for those persons who are unemployed as a result of COVID-19. Along with assistance in kind and in cash, we also form part of our service with a national family service section. I said national as it covers all families in need of marital counseling and guided and directed by the court to attend to any matter pertaining to the welfare of a child. The department has gone digital. The department now embraces technology, and this slide is just to show you our online platform where persons now are able to apply for services online, and that information has been captured. So you have a bar chart that speaks of the cash grants, food applicants, persons who apply for rent. All those are shared on the bar graph. And then the pie chart is showing you, and we can capture that too, the number of first-time persons applying for services at the department. And at this present time, our applicants have exceeded over 2,000 persons within 2 months, or even just 1,000 and more, because of this online application form. So I want to end based on our theme, based on our social work month, based on the fact that Ubuntu, I am because we are, because in all of us, and this message comes from our Chief Welfare Officer, who is not only chief, but she's also very artistic. And she has rendered these words to us at this present time, which I too want to share with you. And I will share just part. We do so because we accept the world still needs champions. The poor, the disadvantaged, the vulnerable need us to stand up against the injustices and be that voice amidst the silence. We must live, work, and lead with integrity. We must support each other. And today I salute my champions at home and across the globe. We are and always will be stronger together. I am because we are. So who am I? Who shared with you? I am Sharon Rose Gittins, a product of University of the West Indies. And I am because we are. So I do hope you enjoyed the glimpse of the Caribbean and the glimpse of what's taking place here at the Welfare Department.
Thank you so much. That's been really interesting overview of the whole of the work in the Caribbean. I think I'm getting some feedback as well, so sorry about that. But thank you very much also to Letni and to both of you for giving us this insight into the history of social work and the current activity of social work in the English-speaking Caribbean. And we're going to go now into, I hope, some reflections and possibly some questions. Thank you very much. Thank you to the Caribbean, and bye-bye. Well, thank you very much to all of our participants. And as I said, we're going to run over by about 15 minutes. But it's now my great pleasure to invite Professor Philip Murphy from the Institute for Commonwealth Studies in London University, who's been patiently listening and following the whole programme, for his reflections on a Commonwealth historical perspective on what we've been hearing. Philip, over to you.
David, thank you very much, and thanks to all the participants. I've learned an awful lot from today and from the various presentations. I know time is brief, so I'll try and be brief and really just give you some headings to think about in the rest of the conversation. We very much hope that we can build a bigger research project around this and try and get funding for it. Then the question, I suppose, is what is the immediate need of such a project? And I would suggest that it very much relates to debates going on now about decolonizing the academy and various forms of academic knowledge in various professions. And I suppose we've seen plenty of examples today to suggest that those colonial legacies are quite strong within the area of social work. And indeed, one thinks sort of theoretically back to the work of Edward Said, and the idea that the colonial enterprise was very much tied up with the process of classification and knowledge generation. And social work and sociology are inevitably part of that. But go back a stage further to one of Said's major influences, the work of Foucault. And Foucault saw that very much tied up at an earlier stage with the development of the modern state in Europe in the 19th century. The move from controlling the body to controlling the mind, if you like, the soul. And of course, in Discipline and Punish, Foucault starts with the image of the panopticon, the Victorian prison, as an example of that. So it's fascinating, and I think no accident that the first records held by the IFSW archive are from 1847, the International Penitentiary Congress, bringing together, quote, persons engaged in improving the welfare of the working classes. This is something that relates to Europe as much as it does to the Commonwealth. And indeed, some of those early conferences that the IFSW archive mention in the 1880s and the 1890s is again to time when Europe is looking at its kind of undiscovered poor. Charles Booth famously publishes his book In Darkest England in 1890, making that sort of colonial comparison. And that particular concern with the urban poor is something that we've seen throughout the presentations, as is the link between philanthropy and social control. Now, one might see that connection as being intrinsic to colonialism. On the whole, however, it's characteristic more of the later phase of colonial rule, particularly the post-war phase, as we've seen again and again in the presentations. For most of its duration, colonial rule is relatively laissez-faire, and it took a series of crises to bring to light the degree of poverty and underdevelopment that the colonial state had hitherto tolerated. For that reason, as Charles mentioned, the precursors to the social work profession are largely the missionaries and the churches in the colonial world. So what were those crises? Well, we've heard in the West Indies, the social unrest of the 1930s, which led to the Moyne Commission of 1938 and the first Colonial Development and Welfare Act. Secondly, the collapse of European colonial rule in East Asia in the early 40s, which led to some real soul searching on behalf of the colonial government, sometimes not enough. Marjorie Parham, one of the kind of theorists of late colonial rule, talked about colonial East Ends, the idea that those systems collapsed because they hadn't taken as much attention as they should have done over issues like poverty and development. And of course, two of the cases we've seen, Singapore which in the late colonial phase was part of British Malaya, and Kenya, colonial emergencies in the late 40s, early 50s, which took the colonial governments by surprise and were themselves a sort of a mark of a lack of information available to them. So again, you see this obsessive gathering of knowledge, the better to control, going alongside some very intensive programs of social control in Malaya and Kenya, particularly villagization. And leading overall to what's often referred to as a second colonial occupation, out of which you see this sort of professionalization of social work across the Commonwealth. Two interesting points going into the independence period. Firstly, again, this focus on the urban poor as a problem in early post-colonial Kenya. Secondly, the idea, particularly in Africa, that social work was in some sense marginal to the major development agendas of many African governments. It'd be really interesting to explore that point. So very quickly, some big questions that any research project looking at sort of comparative Commonwealth social work needs to consider. Firstly, the place of gender. It's often suggested that women are marginalized in the development plans of the late colonial state, but clearly women feature very prominently in the stories that have been told so far. So are women an exception to that? How does gender play in the formation of social work? Secondly, the professionalization and professional training of social work, which comes out of this second colonial occupation. What about those Commonwealth networks into the independence period? Are they, in a sense, a continuation of a sort of neo-colonial control, or are they part possibly of a reverse transmission of local expertise across the Commonwealth back to Europe, but also South-South assistance, which was very much behind the idea of the foundation of the CFTC in the early 70s. What does Commonwealth mean in that respect? Fourthly, other outside influences. Charles talks about, Africans leaving Africa, going to other places in the world. What were the US influences? What were the Soviet influences, the Cold War influences? Israel was clearly very important before 1967 in spreading development expertise. Really interesting. Fifthly, a few people have talked about Ubuntu. Does decolonization suggest that there will be a new kind of focus on indigenous cultures, indigenous wisdom, which has so far been excluded from sort of colonial models of social work? Sixth, the preservation of records, really important, physical records, but also preserving living memory through all history. That's clearly got to be a major focus of any research project. And seventhly, and finally, the impact of the pandemic. We talked about crises revealing problems. Pandemic has clearly done that across the world. It's also increased state control. It's also led to these sorts of connections across the Commonwealth, which perhaps are the upside of that and will help us to learn from each other. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you, Philip. All very, very pertinent questions. And because of the time, we're going to just go very quickly round our panel and just ask people for a very quick comment. And perhaps I'm going to have to ask people to be very, very quick, but knowing that we're going to be developing these ideas, as Philip has said. So I'll come to Esther first and then to Nigel. But picking up on what Philip said, the influence of indigenous thinking, local community thinking, and how that links with social work theory and practice. Is there, and this can be linked with the decolonialization of curricula, as we talked about, but Esther, do you have any perspectives on what that actually means in a Singapore context, or perhaps an international context, relating the social work theory and practice as we talked about it, and local community perspectives on helping each other? Esther?
For our department, colleagues are very intensive in doing research. So over the decades, we have actually accumulated local knowledge, local data, and local knowledge base. And for instance, my colleague, Dr. Roslyn Au, who came on in the video, she is very actively doing culturally sensitive practice. So she studies and collect information and data and analyze on the different ethnic groups locally. And therefore, she translates that into her teaching and training of new generations of social work students and social workers in the future. Yes,
thank you. You had your discussion with your colleagues, who I've met myself at various times. You were talking about relating the theory and what you learn to the practice, and the challenges of doing that. And I think that's sometimes also a challenge for governments as well, how they can translate their concepts of what society is and what the economy is, and the real lived experience of people, and how we help people. So that was particularly interesting in Singapore. I'm really frustrated we can't have more discussion, but we're going to do that in our conference in November, October. But thank you, Esther, so much for bringing together your colleagues for that really interesting video.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you. Nigel, any thoughts from your experience in Zimbabwe and in the UK about the engagement with local community perspectives and Ubuntu?
Yes, David. Can you get the video there?
We're seeing your name, but keep going.
Okay. No, I think some of Philip's observations there were really important, I thought, and interesting. Yes, bringing in from the International Penitentiary Conference 1847, the concerns at the beginning of, well, to social control, really, and ensuring order. And this being carried across into the Commonwealth, and the concerns over control of the populations and so on. Then following independence and developing the country's more the decolonization agenda, and more recently indigenization and authenticization of social work, and how that relates to the values of social work, and maybe away from some of the more punitive concerns there may be in most societies. So I think there's a very interesting agenda really for people and for societies, for social work profession really to engage with, to make social work relevant to the emerging needs of the people, linked to what those needs are actually identified as by people themselves, rather than by outside concerns, outside agencies, and outside interests. So I think that's the important thing for the future really, is to develop this indigenous and social indigenous perspective, engaging in social justice.
A big question around who defines the problems. Is it the local people, local community, or is it governments impose their definition of problems on people?
Absolutely.
And social work caught in the middle of this is a classic tension. I think Fiona had gone off to sleep, Nigel. So
yeah, it's very late there.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the insights into the archives. I'm not sure if Charles Mbugua was able to join us. I know he was having some problems. Charles, are you there? I think Charles isn't there, so I will move on. Letney, if we can come to you. I know Sharon Rose has had to go and work, so she's left us. But Letney, if you're there, do you have any perspectives on this local definition of problems as against imposed definitions? I don't hear Letney coming, but I see Charles Mbugua has joined us. Charles, are you able to join us? Can you unmute and say anything? I see your name is on the screen. The technology doesn't always serve us perfectly. I can't hear you, Charles. Well, I think we're going to have to draw the discussion to a close there. And thank all of our participants. We've got a brief closing ceremony to follow, but my thanks to everybody, and back to the team in Chennai who've kept us all going remarkably smoothly. Congratulations to all of you, and back to you in Chennai.
Thank you, Dr. David, for chairing the whole session of today's webinar. It was indeed a great and an insightful session, which really made us to travel back to the past and could really perceive that how social work profession has shifted its gears across the globe. We are here in the final labs of this webinar. Gratitude is the fairest blossom which springs from the soul. Let me repeat, gratitude is the fairest blossom which springs from the soul. We thank God Almighty for the abounding grace that He has showered upon us from the beginning until towards the end by making this webinar a great success. Now, I would like to invite Dr. David for giving the concluding remarks. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jemmy, and all the team, and to all of our speakers. There's been a lot of preparation and work, as you can imagine, to enable this to come together. And to Philip, thank you for your interest and the interest of the Institute for Commonwealth Studies and the University of London. We have put together a steering group involving a number of universities, and we'll be planning an event which we hope will be in October or November, an online event which will explore some of the themes that Philip spelt out. And for social workers, Philip, they will all be very familiar themes, ones that we're well used to discussing, but exploring it in a Commonwealth context is really crucial. And it's important that we own our own history. As a profession, many people write about us, and governments frequently like to define our identity, often by being critical, when the criticism should probably be directed towards them and some of their policies. But we have our place as well, and that's why it is so important that we make a contribution to recording and shaping the history of social work and social development. So thank you to everybody, and a special thanks to our team in Chennai and the students for doing all the hard work on this under the direction of Sylvia and other colleagues. It's been really run very, very smoothly, and very, very many thanks to you. And now I hand back to Chennai for the final conclusion.
Thank you, sir, for your kind words. Last but not least, let me invite Dr. D. Prince Anadure to wind up today's webinar by proposing word of thanks. Dr. Anadure, the organizer and associate professor, Madras Christian College, was also the Dean of Student Affairs at Madras Christian College. Sir's area of expertise include community organization and social work research in the fields of public health, family and child welfare, and environmental social work. He extends his benevolent services to the people who are in need. We are glad to have you, and over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Good evening from Chennai. And today is a historical day. So we are commemorating and celebrating the World Social Work Day. Um, on behalf of Social Work History Network, Commonwealth Organization for Social Work, Madras Christian College Department of Social Work, we would like to thank all the participants in general, all the speakers in general. I'll come out with specific thanks a little later. Remembering history and celebrating history is very important. If we don't remember and if we don't celebrate the history, it's an injustice that we commit to the future generation. History is the study of yesterday, today, to understand future. History is the study of yesterday. We are doing it today to understand our future. So we need to study the yesterday to have a better understanding of the future. Social work profession, social work course in academia, it is deeply rooted in the democratic values, principles, and the governance. Today, a lot of countries, they are drifting away from these democratic values. We really do not know how these countries are going to be, these governance are going to be after 50 years, after 70 years, or after 100 years. So what we have done today, it's going to speak after some years and how was the social work profession and the history of social work profession. And again, on behalf of the organizers, we like to place on our records our speakers, Ms. Fiona Robertson, IFSW archivist, for talking about the history of IFSW, Dr. Esther Go, Head Department of Social Work, National University of Singapore, for her presentation on history of social work in Singapore, Mr. Charles Mugua, former IFSW Africa President and former COSW Chair, for his presentation on development of social work, social service and community development before and after 1963. Then Dr. Letin Rock, Acting Head, Institute for Gender and Development Studies, the University of West Indies, as well as Ms. Sharon Rose Gittens, Chair, Barbados Association of Social Workers, for their presentation on overview of development of social work in Caribbean and as well as in Barbados. Next, I would like to place on our record Professor Philip Murphy, the Director, Institute of Commonwealth Studies, for his reflections on the webinar from a Commonwealth historical perspective as a historian. As well, Mr. Nigel Hall, the past chair of COSW. A special word of mention and thanks to Mr. David N. Jones, Dr. David N. Jones, for his leadership, which has spearheaded all the activities of this webinar, for the successful conduct of this webinar. Thank you so much, sir. He's the COSW representative, Commonwealth Institutions UK, for your leadership, for your support and guidance throughout this webinar, sir. I would like to place on my record my sincere appreciation and gratitude to my dear colleague, Dr. Sylvia Dicey. It's a joy to work with you, Sylvia, for your imminent leadership, and especially in these Commonwealth institutions and related work. My head of the department, Dr. Miriam Samwell, for all his support and encouragement in every activities of the department, and especially in this Commonwealth webinar. And also my principal, Dr. Wilson, for his support and as well as his encouragement in all the activities of the Department of Social Work. A special word of mention to my dear student friends, Israel Douglas, Jemima, Tarani, Sharon, Hudson, Jairaj, Sambal Jairaj, Shalom, Zerlin, Gibson, and Moses for your untiring work. As it was mentioned by David Jones in his remarks, though in the midst of your internal assessment examination, you spared your valuable time for this wonderful conduct of the webinar. We thank you and we pray that God would shower his blessings. So thank you so much, and especially all the dear participants across the globe. It's yet another successful webinar from Commonwealth Organization, and from the Department of Social Work. Hope to see you in similar ventures in future. Thank you and God bless.
Thank you, sir. And thank you all for your kind participation for this webinar. I remind you all to fill the feedback and attendance forms which have been shared in the chat box to receive your e-certificates. And while we end this webinar, let me remind you all to hold the theme of the Ubuntu, I am because we are, in the days ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. David. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Eagle Hall. Sorry if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Charles Mukua.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah, we look forward to further collaboration.